Well, good morning again. It is great to be with you guys today, and it's always good to be in California and be able to see folks. You don't get to see all that often, and all of that. And I have really enjoyed this whole conference and just being able to be here. And so I want to say thank you for having us to come out to do this, but also to you for coming. I know there's a lot of places you could have been this weekend. A lot of different activities that are going on at different places and what have you, but it has hopefully been beneficial for you. And we're going to talk in this session about something that I actually really enjoy talking about, and it's something that I have experienced over almost the last decade that I have been traveling and visiting Free Will Baptist churches. It's been almost 10 years ago that I left the pastorate and started my first non-pastorate ministry was as the state mission director for the state of Oklahoma, which I did for 6.5 years. And then the last 2.5 years, I've been the director of church planting for home missions, and I have had the opportunity to travel and visit a lot of churches over the last almost 10 years. And I used to say I have been in a lot of different Free Will Baptist churches, and I think I have, but when you compare it to how many David Crow has been in, I haven't been in very many churches, but over the last 10 years, I've been in about 200 different Free Will Baptist churches. And one thing that does is that kind of forces you and makes you look at some things that you wouldn't normally probably even notice. I mean, I pastored for a long time, and I was a staff pastor at a couple of other churches before I was a senior pastor. And when you're heavily involved in church and ministry, and it's just what you do, and kind of like what Brother David preached last night, it's more than just what you do. It becomes who you are, and you just become so ingrained in that culture of your church. You really, and I think I can prove this through my experience in traveling and visiting different churches, but you really don't notice things going on around you. When it's comfortable, when it's usual, when it's what you're used to every single week, you don't really notice a lot of things that are happening around you. For example, I went to this one church one time in Oklahoma, and it was a good drive for me, a couple hours, 2.5 hours, something like that, and it was a small rural country church out in the middle of nowhere, and I remember going. It was cold winter morning, and cold winter in Oklahoma, not in California. So I mean, it was like really cold. And I know you guys wear parkas when it's 50, but because I grew up here, I know that. I know I grew up in Orange County, but it was cold. And I drive into the building, up to the parking lot, and I go into the church, and the first thing is I asked the pastor, I said, hey, where's the restroom? Been on the road for a while, and he says, well, it's outside around the corner on the side of the building. I thought, outside is it an outhouse? What is this thing? We're in a rural church, whatever. So I go out, and you remember the old gas stations that used to have bathrooms that opened up literally to the outside? Now, it was a building, or a little room in the building, but the door was actually an exterior door. And I thought, wow, this is bad. And I feel sorry for the women, that have restrooms that, are freezing cold like that. And so I do what I need to do and come back. And I walk in the foyer, and I notice there's this huge stain on the carpet right in the foyer of the church. And of course, I'm there to represent the state mission department, and I'm not there to point out problems in the church or whatever. So we go through the service and all this kind of thing. And so in my mind, I'm thinking about all these things that I'm observing in it. And this was early on in my ministry as state mission director. So just kind of file all that away in your mind. Well, several weeks or a couple of months later, we have our state mission board meeting. And we come to our meeting, and we're sitting there with our 7 board members. They're all great guys that serve as pastors mainly from the state of Oklahoma. And we're sitting there, and we're just talking about, my job, because I was fairly new at this job and what have you. And I said, well, how's it been? How's the traveling been? And what are, some things you're experiencing? And I said, I've learned some things that I didn't realize I was going to learn. And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, Well, I said, I was in this one church just not that long ago, and I said, you had to go outside to use the bathroom. And I said, I walk in the church, and there's this huge stain in the carpet in the foyer. It looked like somebody had been murdered there. I mean, it kind of was, weird. It just kind of freaked me out. And as I'm saying this, I look up and I realize the pastor sitting at my table. He's one of our board members. And I could see the look on his face when I said that. And he said, you're talking about my church. And I said, I was faced with that momentary decision, Am I honest? Do I lie to keep from hurting somebody's feelings? And I didn't have to answer because he knew. And he said, you know what? He said, I hadn't really ever thought about it before. He said, because we're just kind of used to that. And he said, but that stain does look kind of bad on the carpet. He said, I know why it's there. I mean, I know what happened, but somebody that visits our church wouldn't know that. And that kind of started in my mind a process of thinking about how many things do we just get used to that don't really mean anything to us anymore. But when somebody comes and visits our church, it can be a real distraction. It can be something that can cause a lot of uncomfortable feelings. And really, it can cause people to really question whether or not they even want to come back to your church for a second visit before they ever even hear or see anything or meet anybody or whatever. So we're going to talk today about creating a wow factor in your church. How do you like that slide? I've seen some that look like that. It took me a long time to make that look that good. When I showed it to my wife, she said, oh, that's terrible. And I said, that's my point. But a lot of times when we approach church and we think about church, it is something that we just last minute kind of put together, throw together. We run out of time. Whatever. I was thinking about this as Brother David was preaching just in the last hour. And so many of the things that he said really applies to this topic in this too, that, about being generous. And how many times have people, if you're a pastor, you can relate to this, and I was a pastor for a long time, and how many times has somebody from your church come to you and said, Pastor, I've got this old upright piano that is in my basement, and nobody's used that thing in 20 years. I'd like to get it out. Can we donate that to the church to put in the fellowship hall? It's like, that's exactly what we need in the fellowship hall, is an out-of-tune, 100-year-old piano that weighs 10,000 pounds, But that's kind of the mentality a lot of times. We want to give God the things that we're finished with or that we're ready to discard. And then we expect, the church just to, use that stuff or whatever. But what I want to really kind of share with you today is just some things, hopefully, that will spark some thought in your own mind and help you go back and look at things from a little different perspective in your own church. I want to kind of give you, by way of introduction here, I want to just talk about something that's very interesting in the church. And I'm actually going to talk about this more in the next hour when I talk about recruiting volunteers. But church is a very interesting thing because really the church is the only institution that I know of or that I could think of that has the high level of importance that it has in our society and in our communities, but is run by 99% or maybe even higher of volunteers. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, if your pastor is paid full-time, then he's probably the only paid person, or maybe there's a second staff person or a secretary if the church is larger or whatever. But it's interesting that the church is largely run by volunteers, and so a lot of times we kind of dismiss the idea of excellence in what we do at church, thinking, well, they're volunteers, we can't expect much out of volunteers or whatever. And I want to say we can expect a lot out of volunteers, especially when it comes to things about the church, because the church is a very important institution that God has ordained to be, I think, what we need to make it the best that we possibly can make it. Let me give you a few illustrations and see if any of these sound familiar. The preschool Sunday school teacher shows up late on Sunday morning, and an irritated mom has to stay in the room to watch 6 2-year-olds and misses half of her own class because she's in there watching the kids. Or the junior boys teacher calls the pastor 30 minutes before Sunday school to tell him he's not going to be able to make it today to teach his class. So he suggests, let's just combine the junior boys class with the junior girls class. But the pastor knows that the girls class has a special mother-daughter tea planned. And so at the last minute, he's trying to scramble around and find someone to go in and teach the junior boys who would be totally unprepared. The lady scheduled to sing a special Sunday morning. She walks into church and gets up on stage just before she sings, and she says, well, I haven't had much time to practice this week, so just listen to the words of the song. Y'all have heard that before, haven't you? Or you've been planning this special church-wide event for months. The flyers have been printed, the announcements in the bulletins have been made, the newsletters have gone out. All of this preparation is done, and then the week before, 4 key families come and tell you they've decided to go out of town that weekend. Or visitation night rolls around like it does every week, and only one person shows up again. Or you pull up to the church on Sunday morning and you notice the grass hasn't been cut, the flower beds are still full of weeds, and the Jones family who were supposed to take care of all of that, and sorry if your last name is Jones, but they called you at 8 o'clock this morning and said they decided to go camping this weekend so they couldn't get their jobs done. Do I need to go on? I think you get the idea of this is really true life stuff that happens in all of our churches, right? I mean, like I said, I pastored for a long time. I know I've had all these things happen in my church. That's where I got these examples. These things are things I've experienced. And they're certainly not pleasant things, but they're things we have to deal with all the time. So how do we deal with these kind of things? How do we figure all this stuff out? Well, there are some things that I think are important when it comes to really ensuring excellence in ministry. And I think that we can expect excellence even when it comes to volunteers in our church. Like I said, I'll talk more about that in the next session. But working with volunteers who do what they do out of the goodness of their heart and aren't paid for anything, and really sometimes get very little recognition or even a pat on the back, sometimes that can be very challenging in figuring out how we need to work with these types of volunteers and how we need to make all this happen to ensure excellence in our churches. But I really believe, and this is what I want to get to, because I really think that one of the main problems when it comes to dealing with volunteers and how we create a wow experience or wow factor in our church is that one of the main reasons why we struggle with volunteers is because of a lack of training. It's a lack of training. I mean, how many, think back to different jobs that you've had in the church. And maybe even as a pastor, I talk to a lot of pastors who feel like they're not properly trained. I talk to a lot of volunteers who feel like they have not had any training whatsoever when it comes to jobs that they've been asked to do in the church. And it's no wonder that a lot of times people don't perform at a level that they should be performing at because they don't feel adequate, they don't feel resourced, they don't feel trained, they don't feel like they have really any qualifications to do what it is they've been asked to do, but because they don't want to tell the pastor no, or because they feel like they may be letting God down or whatever. A lot of people volunteer for jobs that they shouldn't even have in the first place, and they aren't trained. And so they don't do a good job, and we don't see faithfulness, and we don't see a high level of commitment out of them because they're frustrated. And so, we've all experienced these things. We all know exactly what I'm talking about. So what do we do about this? How do we handle these types of things? And I think the answer is in the training that we need to have to be able to perform excellent and expect excellence in ministry. And I think that even volunteers who don't get paid anything can perform at a higher level of excellence if we just help them know what to do. And I believe, just as Brother David preached earlier, I believe that God expects our very best. He expects us to be good, and He expects us to be gracious, and all those things that He talked about. And most of our people would be able to do better, I think, in ministry if we did help them excel, if we helped them to do some things. And so there are so many pieces to this and so many moving parts, but I want to try to focus in on just how we can create a wow experience in your church. But let me kind of just hit this volunteer thing a little bit more. Like I said, I'm going to talk about it more in the next session, but they kind of overlap, and I have to kind of share this to be able to build the groundwork here. But if we expect to build a wow experience in our church, or be able to make it where we call, guest friendly, or where people would feel comfortable coming to our church or whatever, we need to train our people to be able to do certain things to make that happen. And so when we recruit volunteers or get volunteers in our church, we need to make sure that certain things happen. One of those things is we need to make sure that they have clear, specific tasks with clear expectations. A lot of times, we just ask volunteers very, very broad things, or ask them to do very broad things. In other words, we might say, would you be willing to help out in our children's ministry? Or, would you be willing to oversee our small groups? Well, what does that really mean? I mean, 10 different people would interpret that in 10 different ways. And I'm not sure that anybody would necessarily know exactly what they were being asked to do if you're just asked to work in our children's ministry. Well, does that mean, I'm supposed to teach a lesson? Does that mean I'm supposed to just help corral kids and make sure nobody breaks an arm or a leg? Or am I supposed to bring snacks for these kids? I mean, what does it mean to work in our children's ministry? So we need specific tasks with clear expectations, but they also need training. And I think that if we provided training, which a lot of churches don't do at any level, but we need to provide training for our teachers, not trying to tell them what they need to teach or how they need to teach it, because that's going to obviously vary for age group or whatever, but you need to have some kind of a training program for your Sunday school teachers, for your youth workers, for all of the people that do some type of teaching ministry in your church. Provide some training for them so they'll feel more comfortable in knowing what is expected of them and what they, really are expected to do, that there are those clear expectations. And that can look different for different churches and different places. And there's all kinds of resources out there. There's online resources for teacher training. There's, various opportunities that you can find that can help provide training for your team that isn't going to cost a lot of money, or it isn't going to be something that is going to be, impossible for even a small church to do, but your people need to be trained. Your people also need to know that there is an end in sight. And what I mean by that is how many times have you heard of or thought of a teacher that has been teaching Sunday school for 30 years or whatever, because once you get in, there's no out. And a lot of times we can't get people to volunteer to do things because they know that once they start teaching that class, they're going to be teaching that class until Jesus comes back. I mean, there's just no way to get out. And I think that if you give people an opportunity and say, hey, would you be willing to do this job for 6 months? Or would you be willing to do this job for 1 year? I mean, people, I think, would be a lot more willing to say, yeah, you know what? I'll teach a Sunday school class if I can commit for 1 year. And then at the end of that year, if things haven't worked out, I can bow out graciously and not have to, feel like I'm letting somebody down or be embarrassed or whatever. Or at the end of that year, if things have gone great, hey, you can sign up for another year and you can, we can do it on a yearly basis or whatever. But there needs to be an end in sight. And then going along with that, but there needs to be a way to get out of things if it doesn't work out. I've shared this story before, but when I was pastoring, I had this lady in my church, and her name was Donna. And Donna did a lot of jobs in the church. She played the organ. She taught a Sunday school class. She worked with youth. She worked in the nursery. She helped with meals. She made the best peanut butter pie that I've ever tasted anywhere. She did all kinds of stuff. And I remember going to Donna one day, and I don't even remember what the job was, but I asked her if she would do something, some type of job. And she looked at me, and she kind of had this look on her face and kind of sighed, and she said, sure. And her expression didn't quite match the answer, because it was really a no on her face, but she said yes. And I said, do you mind? Do you mind doing this or what? And she said, well, Pastor, I would never tell you no. And so I thought, okay. That's a score, right? I mean, pastor wants somebody that'll never tell him no. And so I found myself repeatedly going back to Donna, asking her to do things, but it didn't take me long to realize there was about half or three-fourths of the jobs that Donna was supposed to be doing, they weren't getting done. And it wasn't because she wasn't willing, it wasn't because she wasn't gracious, and it wasn't because she wasn't a wonderful person that would do anything for me as her pastor, but it was because I'd asked her to do way too many things just because she always told me yes. And I had to go back and say, you know what, Donna, I'm sorry, I've asked you to do way too many. You are spread way too thin. There's no way you can get these things done. And she was frustrated, and she was, so overworked, and she had a full-time job outside of church. And so, I had to go back and say, you know what, let's take some of these things away. Let's figure out something else here. And a lot of times we do that to people in our church just because they're willing to say yes. But if they're not really gifted, or they're not really the type of person that needs to be doing certain things, we're not doing ourselves any favor by asking them to do that. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about creating the wow experience in your church. Because there's a lot involved in this, and again, since volunteers are so important in this whole thought process, it's important that we started with that. But we need to talk about the guest experience or the wow experience when it comes to our churches. Because really, if a person in your community that has absolutely no connection to your church, okay, they don't have family or friends or whatever that comes to your church. They don't love your church. They don't know anything about your church. So they don't have any loyalty to you whatsoever. If that type of a person was to come to your service, what would they see? What would they experience? Would they, feel like they were expected? Would they feel like they were, accepted and loved? Would they feel like, though, when they walked in that, you know what, these people don't act like they really care if I'm here? And we've all experienced that, right? We've all experienced those services. And like I said, when you visit a lot of churches like we do in our office, and we're traveling a lot and all that, I'm always the visitor, okay? And a lot of times, I'm preaching at these churches, and they know that because I'm wearing the microphone, or my picture's been in their bulletin or what. They know I'm the guest preacher, and you'd be surprised still about how many churches that I go to and that I visit that no one ever says a word to me. They don't welcome you. They don't shake your hand. Maybe somebody will hand you a bulletin at the door. Now, that doesn't happen everywhere, but it does happen. Where, during that meet and greet time when you stand up and between songs and everybody goes around and shaking hands and all of that, and sometimes I look around, and if there's a visitor, the visitors are the ones standing there while the little groups congregate, and everybody's welcoming each other that they know and that they wanted to talk to, and maybe ask them about something they thought about and they needed to see them at church, and remember to tell them about this or tell them about that or whatever. And the visitors a lot of times are just standing there awkwardly waiting for this greet time to be over so they can sit back down. And we need to just think about the kind of experience that guests would have in our churches. And let me just insert this and say this, because this is something that I just recently read about. According to Tom Rayner and some research that he did, and he's with Lifeway and does a lot of research, what have you. And he said that the average church, and I'm going by memory on these statistics, so if I could be off a little bit, but this is pretty close. He says the average church of 100 people will lose 10% of their people, or excuse me, they'll lose 5% of the people just by attrition every year. Okay? So if you have a church of 100, 5 people in your church every year are going to move away, die, get mad and leave, whatever, on average. So if you don't do anything, if you just stay static, in 1 year, you're going to go from 100 to 95. The next year, you're going to go to 90, and the numbers are going to get a little different because of the percentage changes, but just for easy math, because I have to do easy math because I can't do math in my head. But it's not going to take very long to where your church is going to be in serious decline, okay? Now, Rayner also says that on average, every first-time guest that you have in your church only 10% of them will come back for a second visit. So that means you have to have 10 first-time visitors to get one to come back to be a second-time visitor. Now, this is on average across denominations, a lot of different cultures and contexts, and that may be a lot different where you are, whatever. I don't know. This is just on average overall. So if you think about that, like I said, I'm not great at math in my head, but it takes a lot of first-time visitors that come back for a second visit, because it's only 10%, to even make up that 5% you're going to lose by attrition, let alone start gaining people in your church. Does that make sense? And so we've got to figure out a way how we are going to drive a lot of new first-time guests through our front door. We've got to figure out a way that we can get a lot of people coming through. You can't sustain even where you are, let alone grow, by only having 1 or 2 visitors every week or every other week. Your church is not going to be able to reach people in your community and grow with those types of numbers. And so that's where the outreach comes in. Outreach, we talked about that yesterday, and how outreach needs to drive people. Remember, the goal was the Great Commission, but obviously we have to get people to our church to hear the Great Commission, to be able to minister, disciple them, and all of that. And so the idea is you want to drive as many first-time guests to your worship services as you can. So when you bring those people in that have no connection to your church, no loyalty to your church, what is their experience going to be when they walk in your church for the first time? And that's what we really need to think about. And so how do we create a wow experience in our church? And what I mean by that is, that's kind of a strange way to say it maybe, but how do you create a wow experience? Another way to say that is, how do you exceed people's expectations? Again, according to Tom Rainer, he says the first-time visitor at your church expects 3 things when they walk in your door. They expect your church service to be boring. They expect your people to be unfriendly, and they expect you to ask them for money. That's what Tom Rainer says, 3 things that unchurched people expect when they go to church. So what does that mean? That means that you need to exceed their expectations. Now, that's not hard with those, right? I mean, hopefully that's not hard. But we've got to think about these types of things so that we can make people at ease and let them bring the walls down and bring the guard down, so that when we preach the message of salvation, that there are not all these peripheral walls and barriers and guards that are up, so that they can hear the message and the Holy Spirit has an opportunity to deal with their heart and we can see people saved. That's the goal. And so it's not about trying to make our churches like some kind of a big, fancy social club or whatever. I'm not advocating anything like that. I'm just saying that we need to take down whatever barriers we can, remove whatever hindrances we can, and exceed the expectations of what people expect, so that when they come inside the church, they find out, this isn't boring. These people are friendly. And it is okay to ask for money because they know you're going to pass the plate, but there's even ways that you can put them at ease with that, and we don't have time to get in all of that. But so how do you do this? How do you exceed people's expectations? And there are so many different factors to this, but I want to just kind of use an analogy here to help you think through this. Because just imagine that there's a young lady getting ready to go out on her first date with a nice young man. She wants to make a good first impression, right? And hopefully the guy does too, but girls just seem to be more focused on this. So she's going to focus on a few important things. She's going to make sure that her personal appearance is the very best that it can be. Now, if you happen to be that maid that Brother Dave was talking about that has 2 teeth that happen to be from Kentucky, there's not much you can do. But you're going to do the best with what you've got, right? I mean, you're going to really do the best with what you've got, your personal appearance. If the young man's going to come to her home and pick her up, she's probably going to tidy the place up, right? You're going to make sure that everything's in its place, and you don't want to be embarrassed when you open the door and invite the young man in before you go out. And she's going to think about what she's going to say. She's going to think about how she's going to greet him. She's going to think about, what that's going to be like and tries to think through how all of this is going to happen. And then she's going to think about, the end of that date, and she's going to make sure he understands that, she doesn't kiss on the first date and all of this and how that can be awkward, but she's got it all figured out in her mind. And then she's going to think about what happens if he asks me for a second date? What's my answer going to be? Or how am I going to make sure that he understands that I'm interested and he asked me for a second date? And so she's going to think through all these different things, or at least hopefully she would. And the same thing should be true about the church, but I really don't think we do think about these things a lot of times. Because if you relate that to a first-time visitor coming to our church, I want you to think about those same kind of major categories. First of all, how do your people look? Now, I don't mean are they, toothless or, have whatever, but how do they look? And I'm not even talking about the way they dress or anything like that. I'm talking about our presence and our acceptance of people and all of that. Do our people smile and look friendly? Do our people look like, they want new people to come in? I have been in churches, and I have actually seen this happen. When a guest walks in the door, I've heard people go, "Who's that? I don't recognize those people. What are those people doing here?" Or, something like that. Maybe not those exact words, but we've all seen those kinds of things happen. Well, if you happen to be the guest walking in, that's going to make you feel real welcome, right? But so do they look friendly? Do they look approachable? Sometimes we don't look very approachable. We're so focused on doing what we're supposed to do on Sunday morning. We're darting here and there, and believe me, nobody's worse than I am at this. I mean, I'm one of those guys that when I've got a task to do, I focus and I can appear to be sometimes totally out of touch with everything going on or whatever, and that's just kind of my personality. But you have to work on those types of things. Do I look approachable? Do we look like we really want guests to come to our church? And that's why I think it's so important that, most churches have greeters, somebody at the door. But I advocate all the time to churches that I go to, all the time, we need to train all of our people in our church to be greeters. Every single person in our church is a greeter, especially in a small church. Because we've got to help people understand that it's very, it's weird being that first-time guest in a church that you've never been to before. You don't know anybody there. Maybe they've come to one of your outreach events and they decide they're going to visit your church, and then they walk in the door. They don't know a single person. They don't know what's going on. They don't know where they're supposed to go. They don't know anything. That is, for most people, unless you're just a really, wildly extroverted kind of person, which some people are, and that's fine. But for most people, it's just going to be a weird feeling. And so we've got to try to do something to train our people to make those people feel at ease. And so we need to train all of our people to be greeters. How do you do that? Talk about it. Use a Wednesday night service or a Sunday night service or a training time that you have at your church at some point or whatever, and say, hey, we're going to talk about how we need to respond when guests come to our church. We want to talk about how we would like to see you respond. And I've even done this on a Wednesday night at the church where we attend in Nashville. Pastor had me do a greeter training thing to train all of our church people to be greeters. And it's something that we need to talk about, and so people think about it. And a lot of times we need to just train people to connect with visitors on a very personal level, because a lot of times when a visitor comes in, you just smile and shake their hand, say, hi, how are you? Fine. And you walk on. But that's not really a connection. Maybe you've greeted them, but that doesn't really make a person feel at ease. But you can teach your people to ask them just some basic, simple questions like, well, how did you end up visiting us today at First Church or whatever the name of your church is? And they can tell you how they, well, we went to one of your outreach events, or maybe they do know somebody at your church, or you live close by and they live close by and notice your church driving by or whatever. Or you could ask them, do you already know someone who attends here? Or are you meeting someone here that you know? Or would you like to sit with us in the service? And that would make somebody feel at ease, wouldn't it? If they just think, oh, you know what? I was worried about sitting in somebody's seat and somebody getting mad at me, because I know how these church people are, right? They're unfriendly. And so somebody invites you to sit with them, that it relaxes that fear, and you put them at ease. And then, you can let people know you don't expect them to to do anything. You don't expect anything from them. Treat them like you would treat a guest that comes to your home. When a guest comes to my home, my wife or I will escort them into the living room and ask them would they like to sit down, and can I get you something to drink? Would you like a snack? Or if they happen to sit down in my chair, I don't say, hey, that's my chair. Get up out of the recliner. You sit over there on the uncomfortable end of the couch down there. We don't do that in our home, but I've heard those horror stories of people doing it in church, right? You've heard the story of people coming in saying, well, that's my seat, but since you're a visitor, I'll let you sit there this week. Or, excuse me, that's my seat, will you move down, or whatever. I can't believe that really happens, but it does. And we wouldn't do that to people in our homes, and we need to treat people in our churches like valued guests, just like we do in our home. Another big thing is how many times have you asked somebody their name, and the second it comes out of their mouth, you don't remember what it is? We're all guilty of that, right? I'm guilty of that. But especially when it comes to a visitor, if you think about it ahead of time as you're approaching that person, okay, I'm going to ask them their name. When they say their name, I'm going to remember it. So, hi, what's your name? Hi, my name is so-and-so, whatever. You connect it to something, you remember it somehow. You make a mental note so you can remember it, and then ask them those questions. Hey, is this your first time here? Are you meeting someone here? Would you like to sit with my wife and me? Is there anything I can get you? Do you need to know where anything is? Can I help you find something? Whatever. And then as you're taking them to your seat to sit with you, or as you're escorting them to the children's area to drop their kids off or to use the restroom or whatever, you can stop by and say, hey, Brother Jim, let me introduce you to Brother Mike here. He's my new friend I just met this morning that's visiting our church. And you introduce him by name. I tell you, my wife and I had an experience like that several months ago now, but we went by invitation of a pastor to a church as the secret shoppers. No one knew us. And he said, I don't want you to tell anybody who you are. I don't want anybody to tell anybody why you're here. I just want you to get the real first-time guest experience. And then I was meeting with his staff on Monday to tell them how this was going, how this all went Sunday. I was a nervous wreck. This guy happened to be a board member for the National Home Missions Board, okay? So last thing I wanted to happen was a bad experience. But I'm telling you, there was a few little glitches early on, and we talked through those things, but the overall experience was phenomenal. And we went up to their welcome center, and there was a young lady there that greeted us, and then she called a man standing off to the side to come, and who happened to be her father, we later found out. But he was the most pleasant and most helpful man that I have ever been around. And he took my wife and I, and he introduced himself to us. He asked us our names. He took us up to Sunday school class and walked with us and showed us where it was, asked us to sit down in the class. He sat down next to us, and every single person that walked in that Sunday school room door, he introduced them to me. Every single person. And he called me by name. He told me their name. Not that I remembered them, because I didn't remember any of them, but he remembered us. And he introduced me to every person that came in. It made me feel so relaxed and so at home. And then after Sunday school, he said, come with me. And we walked back around, down the stairs and around the hallway. And my wife, I think one of us said we need to use the restroom. And so he escorted us to the restroom. And he stood outside and waited outside the door. And we came out, and he was there again. And I thought, I've got to ditch this guy. I want to get a better experience of, what's going on in this church, and this guy won't leave me alone. And he was right there, and he was so attentive to our needs. And it made our experience so good, and it made us feel so comfortable that he had to go and greet at another door. So there was a point finally where he said, I'm going to have to let you go in. I've got to leave you here, but is there anything I can get you, or anything I can help you do, or you need to have any questions before I kind of hand you off and let you go sit down? And we're like, no, we're fine. We're good, and all of that. And it was just the most pleasant thing to have somebody know our name, introduce us to people, and he made us feel so much at ease. It was such a pleasant experience. And so just introduce yourself to people, remember their name, introduce them to other people, and never just point out to somebody where something is. Don't tell them, the restrooms are down the hall, take a right, go up the stairs, take a left, go down the stairs, take a right. Just take them there. Let me just show you where it is. Even if it's not difficult, show them. Introduce them to other people. all of those things. So just making the guest experience, the first time experience, a pleasant one. Let's talk briefly about the condition of facilities. The condition of your facilities. You know what your place looks like. You know where everything is. You know why the stains in the carpet. You know all this kind of stuff, but your visitors don't know these things. And so all I'm going to say here, and Jim dealt with this in his seminar that he does a little bit from kind of a comical standpoint, which is hilarious, but just looking at some certain things at your church. And I want to just encourage you to think about your church and think about, how does your church look? Again, you have to, that's not it. Okay, go back. How does your church look? Is it clean? Is it well kept? How does your church smell? Does your church smell like a 1950s funeral home? A lot of churches do. Just believe me, I've been in a lot of them that do. How does your church feel? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? And I know you can't always, you're certainly not going to please everybody and all of that. But is your church, did someone get there in time to make sure it was comfortable and all of that? Is it arranged? Are classes arranged comfortably and ahead of time? Are rooms too crowded, or are rooms too empty? Does it not? Do you not have critical mass? Are things that happen in your Sunday school classes or small groups or whatever you have, are they age appropriate? How does all of this make you feel? How does it sound? And I'm not just talking about the music in your service or whatever, but I'm talking about the entire atmosphere. Are people friendly and talking? Is there prelude music being played before church? There's nothing more awkward than walking into this weird silence. It makes people tense and try to create and teach your people, hey, before church starts, let's be friendly, let's talk, let's have a high level of conversation going on so that people feel comfortable walking in on that. I mean, if you walk into a quiet room where everyone's already sitting there with their hands folded in their laps and it's just really quiet, it's just a very uncomfortable, kind of tense feeling. So you want to create an atmosphere where people feel the friendliness and are talking. It's something that's relaxing and just put people at ease. And then your other sense is taste. How do things taste at your church? What I mean by that is, do you offer refreshments? Refreshments put people at ease before the service. Do you offer people coffee or refreshments or donuts or fruit or whatever? Like I said, when a guest visits your home, we usually offer them something to eat or to drink. And do we have options? Some people don't like to eat donuts. Some people want fruit. I don't understand that, but some people do. I would never turn down a chocolate donut, especially with the white creamy stuff in the middle. I mean, that's just like the best thing in the world. But, some people, don't want that stuff. And so are there options? And then, figuratively speaking, when it comes down to the sense of taste, when people leave your service, do they have a good taste in their mouth? Are they leaving saying, you know what, that was a good experience. They've exceeded my expectations. I want to come back. So, all of that are things that we need to think about with our facility, but also our leadership. What are we going to say and what are we going to do? Do we think, remember the date thing I was talking about, scenario with the young lady. What are we going to say? What are we going to do? Is everything planned out? Does everyone know their responsibilities? Are there high expectations? Do I, as the pastor, have high expectations of the way things are going to happen? Is everyone prepared? Do our greeters know what to do? Do our ushers know what to do? Do our Sunday school teachers know when they're supposed to be here, what they're supposed to do? Are there refreshments? Are they put out? Is everything in order? Everybody that has a responsibility, is everybody prepared ahead of time? And again, you might say, well, how in the world can I make sure all that happens? It comes through that training I was talking about earlier. We've got to make sure our people understand the importance of all these things, and we've got to train them to operate at that high level of excellence so that we exceed people's expectations the very first time that they come to our church. The third area is the people that we deal with in the church, the people that we train in our church as volunteers. We need to think about all of those factors that I talked about as far as how the service goes, but then how are you going to end the service? How are you going to, get visitors to do what they're supposed to do, fill out connection cards, or go to the table to meet the pastor, or whatever. You have to think through all that stuff. Do you have exit greeters that, a lot of times after church it's just like a mass exodus and people are running for the door? But I think it's a good idea to have exit greeters where when the visitors leave, they're thanked for coming to the service and invited back to our next service tonight or next Sunday or whatever, or they're asked if they have any questions about the service or whatever. Is there anything they need or we can help them with before they leave? And then do you have an immediate follow-up plan? Do your people know what to do with these visitors? Do you have a gift to give to them? Do you have some way to connect with them so that you can follow up? And then about that, again, that experience. How are you going to follow up? Do you have a follow-up system in place? Do you have trained people that know how to deal with people even at the altar if somebody was to respond at the altar? Do you have a plan on how to move people from that first-time visitor to a second-time visitor to a third-time visitor to eventually a regular attender to a member? Do you have a process for all of that? Again, there are so many moving parts to this and so many things that we could talk about. And Jim, I always give a plug for his health assessment checkup that he does, because what that does is when you go through an assessment like that for your church, it forces you to look at certain things that you wouldn't normally look at. And I was first introduced to a church assessment type thing back when I was a staff pastor many, many years ago at a church in Ada, Oklahoma. Our now executive secretary, Keith Burden, was a pastor. I was his associate. And church, it was a decent-sized church. We ran probably 450, 500, something like that. And we started going through a self-assessment. We were stuck, and I don't remember all the things that were going on at that particular time. But Brother Keith decided we were going to do a church assessment, and we just were going to do it on our own. And he ordered some materials that we went through and what have you. And he said, all of us, he said, everybody that was on this committee, he said, I want everybody to drive to church and come to church and enter from a new perspective. Don't come the way you always come. Go around the block. Come in from a different way. And I remember I did that the next time that I drove to the church, and I came in from another street where I normally wouldn't come because I lived the opposite direction. And I remember looking at the building, and I noticed that there was a long row of windows on the side of the building that I'd never noticed before. And all you could see in the windows was the backside of batted insulation, fiberglass insulation. And I thought, what is with that? I've never noticed that before. And thinking through this building, I thought, that's the inside of our chapel. Not the sanctuary, built a new sanctuary, but what now we call the chapel. And I thought so when they converted that from Sunday school rooms to a chapel, they just drywalled over the windows and everything and insulated it and just left the windows in there. And so when you look at the building from the outside, you see this insulation in the windows. It just looks really weird on the outside. But my point in that is that I had been on staff at that church for, a couple of years by that time, and I had never noticed that before because I never went to church that way. And I could tell you so many stories about things like that, of things that you don't notice because you just don't pay attention. But if your church is willing and you have the guts to do a self-assessment, you will notice all kinds of things about your church that you've never noticed before. And I think it's a very good thing that we do that. Because if we really want to notice what's going on, we have to take an honest, fresh look at everything we do and why we do it, not just because it's the way we've always done it or what we've always done, but we have to make sure that we do everything for a reason that is going to help us to get those people to come so they can hear the gospel, so that they can respond in a comfortable environment. Now, I know sometimes the gospel makes us uncomfortable. I'm not talking about that part. I'm talking about the aesthetics. And then allows them to come back so that we can continue to minister to them and all of that. So, how do you do that? Well, there's a lot of ways. I think the self-assessment's a good thing. But also, I think it's a good idea to have someone with fresh eyes come in. Somebody that's never been to your church before, maybe a neighbor, and say, hey, I got a kind of a strange favor to ask of you, but I'd like for you to come and visit our church, and I want your real, honest feedback on everything. I want you to tell me how people treat you. I want you to tell me how things look. And boy, you better be prepared. Better be ready if you do that. But it can really help you open your eyes. And so your church can be that church, I think, that does exceed expectations of other people. It can be that place where people say, you know what? When they leave, that was a pretty good service. That was not what I expected. Those people were way friendlier than I expected them to be. And that service wasn't boring at all. Or, they didn't even, harp on money. They took up an offering. But again, everybody expects you. It's church. They expect you to take up an offering. But people have this picture in their mind of what church is going to look like and what church is supposed to do and all of that. And all we need to do is just give people an opportunity to hear the gospel. And the way we do that is by exceeding their expectations, relieving a lot of the stress that they may feel for being a first-time visitor. And so I want to encourage you, go back to your church, think through everything you do. Look at everything that you do in your church. And ask yourself the question, if I was a first-time guest, if I was a first-time visitor at my church, how would I respond to this? How would I feel about this? And there's so many different facets of this that you need to think about. But just start there and think about looking at our facilities, looking at what we do in worship. Does it make sense? Do people just do stuff because it's the way we always do it? Or does it make sense because this is the way we want to best lead people's hearts and minds into an attitude of worship and being drawn to the message or whatever? And just take an honest look at everything you do and try to do something to exceed the expectations of people that may come to your church. And again, if you have any questions or whatever, you're welcome to, I think it's on my next session. I actually put my contact info on there, but feel free to contact us at Home Missions. Any of us in the office are glad to do anything we can to help you or whatever, but we're here to try to help you think through things. We don't have it all figured out. We don't know all the answers. When I pastored, I didn't do everything perfectly. In fact, a lot of the stuff I have learned since I've been a pastor, visiting so many different churches. And so anything that we can offer and help you with, we're certainly glad to do that. But I hope that you'll go home and think about ways that you can create a wow experience so that you can lower those stress levels of visitors. When they come, they can feel at home. They can feel like you love them, you care about them, you expected them to show up. You expected someone new to show up that day because you had all those things in place. And so we pray for you guys and thank you for the opportunity to be able to share this today. We're going to start back in just a few minutes, 10 o'clock. There's 2 sessions. I will be doing how to recruit volunteers in here, and then Jim is doing 4 Steps to Successful Ministry in the youth room down the hall. So you'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll start back up on that last session.